Welcome to Truth in My Days, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hi folks, today we're going to be looking at a short video with the provocative and bold title, Bart Ehrman Destroys Resurrection Claims in 60 Seconds. Well, I don't think he can destroy the resurrection claims at all, let alone in 60 seconds, but that's his claim. So let's have a look at that. Go for it, Bart.
And they don't solve the problem that no matter what you say about your evidence for the resurrection, based on sources written 30, 40, 50, 60 years later, based on this evidence from decades later, you still have an account of somebody rising from the dead that is the one time this has ever happened in the history of the universe, and saying that it's far more probable than somebody came up with a story about it. Okay. But, you can't use that argument. That's warmed over Hume. No, that's wrong. This is how we do history. We decide what most probably happened in the past. And if you tell me that because somebody living 50, 60 years later said Jesus got raised from the dead, that's better evidence that he got raised from the dead than some other evidence, even though resurrection from the dead happened once in the history of the universe, that's more probable than something that happened millions of times every day. Okay, well, I can't help you with your logic.
Well, that was not very impressive. In a backhanded sort of way, it was, I guess, impressive to get every single thing you said wrong, but that's what he managed to do. Let's go through the video again and pause and comment on the claims he's making.
And they don't solve the problem that no matter what you say about your evidence for the resurrection.
That's already a problem there. No matter what you say about the evidence for the resurrection, I would think the evidence is actually primary. It's right up front. When you're going to decide whether something happened or not, you should be looking at the evidence, shouldn't you?
Based on sources written 30, 40, 50, 60 years later.
Now, here's the next problem. He claims that the sources, the gospel books, are written 30, 40, 50, 60 years later. Now, just for a moment, assume that we're correct. Would it be a problem? Well, it really wouldn't, because people do remember in detail impact events, important events from the past, even across this many decades. 30, 40, 50 years. Well, I was married 38 years ago. I remember that quite clearly. I could write quite a detailed account of that day. It was now 54 years ago that we moved to Toronto. I can write very detailed accounts of those after 54 years. So even if these dates were correct, it would not make the information unreliable. Secondly, though, this information is not reliable. According to the actual information we have, which includes internal evidence, it includes the testimony of Eusebius, and it includes the family 35 colophons. Matthew was published 8 years after the resurrection of Jesus. Mark was published 10 years after the resurrection of Jesus. Luke was published 15 years after the resurrection of Jesus. Only John would be 32 years after. Nothing was 50 or 60 years later. And the gospel books are not the only evidence we have for the resurrection. So Bart Ehrman is completely wrong on this count. Let's continue.
Based on this evidence from decades later, you still have an account of somebody rising from the dead that is the one time this has ever happened in the history of the universe.
I thought Ehrman was supposed to know the Bible. Rising from the dead, this is not the first time it happened in the history of the universe. Elijah raised the son of the widow of Zarephath. That's in 1 Kings 17. Elisha raised the Shunammite's son. That's in 2 Kings 4. And Jesus himself raised a number of people, including the son of the widow at Nain in Luke chapter 7, Jairus' daughter in Matthew 9, Mark 5, Luke 8, and of course Lazarus in John 11. How does Bart Ehrman overlook these? Did he just forget? Let's continue.
And saying that it's far more probable than somebody came up with a story about it. Okay, but you can't use that argument. That's warmed over Hume. No, that's wrong. This is how we do history. We decide what most probably happened in the past.
No, that is not how you do history. That is warmed over Hume, and it's used by historians when they're trying to discredit the gospel accounts, but it's not how we do history. And that's beyond dispute. Tell me, what was the last time you heard any historian say that George Washington was probably the first president of the United States? When was the last time you heard any reputable historian say that President Lincoln probably died in 1865? When was the last time you heard any historian say that we probably landed on the moon in 1969? Therefore, you can see this is not true. It's got nothing to do with probability, and it can't. When these historians, these artsies, try to appeal to probability, if they do, they're simply showing that they don't even understand what probability is. Probability is a mathematical reality, and it's quantifiable. It applies to random events with fixed numbers of possible outcomes, fixed number of desired outcomes. Flipping a coin, for example, and where you have nothing that drives one outcome over another. When you flip a coin, there are two possible outcomes, heads and tails. There's one that you want heads. Nothing is pushing it to be heads or tails. So when you flip it, it's going to come up one or the other. You have a 1 in 2 chance of getting a head. That's a 50% probability. When you're rolling a 6-sided die, there are 6 numbers, one number on each side, and nothing is pushing the die to go to any one of them in particular. So 6 possible outcomes, 1 desired one. The chances of rolling, say, a 4 is 1 out of 6. That's how probability works. It applies to random events. It doesn't apply to history because history is not random. History is driven by people, and we see all kinds of unexpected events happening all the time. If the most probable is the thing that happens, there'd be never anything exciting happening in history. Everything would be the same all the time. When it comes to history, probability, you can use probability to describe populations, but not discrete events. For example, suppose Bart Ehrman were taking a class in school, and there are 20 people in the class. He's the only male. There are 19 women in the class and just one man, Bart Ehrman. Now, if you wrote the names of the 20 students on pieces of paper, put them in a hat, shook it up, and somebody pulled out a name, what would be the probability that he would pull out the name of a girl? Well, 19 out of 20, 95%. But if you pull out the name Bart Ehrman, you're not going to say, well, there's a 95% probability that Bart Ehrman is a woman, are you? Right? There may be a 3.6 million to 1 chance that you'll be killed by a shark, but if you're the one that was killed by a shark, for you that probability is full. Probability cannot be applied to historical events, and anybody who understands probability knows that. Let's continue.
And if you tell me that because somebody living 50, 60 years later said Jesus got raised from the dead.
Well, there's the wrong dates again, but let's continue.
That's better evidence that he got raised from the dead than some other evidence.
Some other evidence? What would the other evidence be? What is the actual evidence that Bart or his fellow travelers ever offer against the resurrection? They don't. They can't. They simply say it didn't happen. They simply say, oh, your evidence is not good. But do they ever actually offer countervailing evidence? No. So I'm not sure what he's talking about here when he says other evidence. Let's continue.
Even though resurrection from the dead happened once in the history of the universe, that's more probable than something that happened millions of times every day. Okay, well, I can't help you with your logic.
All right, let me help you with your logic, Bart. Tell me that you believe that the moon landing was a hoax. Tell me you're one of those tinfoil hat wearers, because if you are consistent with your stated principles here, you must believe it's a hoax. Because in all the history of the world, up until July 20th, 1969, and that was the date, it wasn't probably that date, and you're old enough to remember it, Bart, that had never happened before. By your standards, no evidence can override the probability against something that has never happened before in the entire history of the universe. Never before in the entire history of the universe have men ever landed on the moon. So by your standards, you should believe that was a hoax. Do you? Tell us that you do. If you don't think the moon landing was a hoax, then you have just destroyed your entire case here against the resurrection. And you have failed dismally to disprove the resurrection in 60 seconds, let alone at all.